But it's my pleasure to introduce and welcome my friend and former colleague, Andrew Robb. You have Andrew's bio in your book. I just simply wanted to say that I don't know whether I'm supposed to commentate, but my perception has been that as Australia's Trade Minister, he has been doing an outstanding job. The free trade agreements with Japan, the free trade agreement with Korea, and the work that he's been doing on the Trans-Pacific Partnership is very much in our interests. And of course, whereas from an Australian-US perspective, we've tended to focus on the Australian-US free trade agreement, and he may say something about how that is evolving in practice. But now also we're focusing on how Australia and the US can work together in trying to clinch this historic regional trade agreement, an agreement which President Obama has said really lies at the core of his rebalancing to Asia. So Andrew, thank you very much for joining us, and we look forward to your words, and Andrew's kindly agreed to answer a few questions afterwards.
Well, thanks very much, Robert. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, thanks for this opportunity to share some of my thoughts based on the experience of the last 9 months, but also 30 years of going to the United States each and every year, I think, for different reasons over those years. If you think of the US-Australia relationship, I think most people probably think first of all about how we fought side by side in the Pacific and after Pearl Harbor, later codified, of course, through the ANZUS alliance. Our military and strategic cooperation, I think, remains a vital feature of the US-Australia relationship today, and will do so, obviously, I think, for many, many decades to come. It will shape a lot of the century in terms of our relationship and much of the outcomes in the region. But there's another vital strut, I think, to the relationship that's often underappreciated, our major trade and investment role and ties. Today, the USA is the largest investor in Australia, and Australia is the 12th largest provider of foreign direct investment in the United States. The US is one of the top 5 source countries for visitors to Australia in terms of numbers and expenditure. But our economic relationship has a very long history, right back almost as far as the earliest days of European settlement in Australia. Americans have been involved in the economic development of Australia. Fittingly enough, the links probably began with a place in America that was small yet had a uniquely influential role in global supply chains in the 18th and 19th century, the famous Massachusetts whaling town of Nantucket. In 1791, Captain Eber Bunker, a seafarer from Nantucket, was hired to bring the British ship William and Anne from the UK to Australia as part of the Third Fleet. And in 1831, when Australia lifted its ban on American whaling vessels, ships from Nantucket quickly filled the fields. Then in the late 1840s, America and Australia influenced each other's economic development in a very significant way. The 1848 California gold rush caused many people to leave Australia for California to search for gold, and this population drain prompted the New South Wales government to relax its prior policy of suppressing news of gold finds, as they had believed a gold rush would cause economic disruption for employers. Sure enough, large-scale gold finds promptly followed in 1851, which led to large-scale immigration to Australia, including many of California's 49ers searching for a new fortune. In 1897, a young American mining engineer called Herbert Hoover came to the world's big new gold discoveries in Western Australia and was appointed mine manager at the Sons of Guyla gold mine, a mine that's still in operation to this day. Later, Hoover was one of the founding investors in the Zinc Corporation, later part of the Rio Tinto Group, which pioneered the production of zinc at the fabulous Broken Hill silver-lead-zinc mining complex. He also went on to do a few things in politics, In the 1920s, the American Smelting and Refining Company, a company whose early investors, including the Rockefellers and then the Guggenheims, was instrumental in underwriting the development of the giant Mount Isa mine base metals complex in Queensland, again a project that's still in operation nearly 100 years later. Even the current foundations of the mighty Pilbara iron ore province were laid in part with American capital. In 1962, the Goldsworthy iron ore mine was developed by a consortium including the Cypress Mines Corporation of Los Angeles and Utah Development Co. of San Francisco. Today, the largest ever Australian investment project, the $56 billion Gorgon gas field LNG export project, is being funded by the US capital from Chevron. And I had the good fortune to spend 2 years on one of the investment teams there before I entered Parliament in 2004. Australia and America are as close as brothers when it comes to our philosophical underpinnings. We believe in freedom and democracy, and we believe in having open, competitive market economies driven by vibrant, successful private sectors. Without in any way underplaying the importance of our strategic cooperation, let me make this prediction. This century, the US-Australia relationship will also be defined by our shared commitment to open markets, business and commerce. And we've already started in a most significant way in shaping so much of what's happening, at least in our region, in that regard. I've just returned from a big business delegation to North America with Prime Minister Tony Abbott. For me, the trip confirmed how much we share when it comes to a belief in a strong, vibrant and open private sector, and that Australia and the US are entering a new phase of our relationship, taking it to the next level, as I call it. And it is centred largely on sustainable growth. Since coming to office, our government has made it very clear that we're open for business. It's a message that resonates and resonated very strongly. In New York last week, I sat with a business roundtable with the seven biggest funds in New York, something in the order of $1.3 trillion under management sitting around the table, and some of the messages about the sorts of policy prescriptions that we were following got a very strong and enthusiastic hearing. We've been busy driving the right conditions for investment and growth. It's a very important part of our economic strategy. Pushing through domestic reform, which is probably the best way of facilitating trade outcomes. We have had uninterrupted economic growth for 23 years, and I would suggest a lot of it is owed to the fact that we're such an open and low protection country. Reforms that increase trade and encourage investment. Using our platform as G20 leader to encourage similar global reforms, removing tariffs and non-tariff barriers, streamlining customs procedures, investing in infrastructure and freeing up trade in services. One of the big lessons of the global financial crisis is that governments alone can't put things right in the economy. And I must say, over the last 9 months, as I've moved around many centres in the world, there is a real disillusionment that I've gleaned with the interventionist policies that so many governments in the developed world put in place since 2008 and never got themselves weaned off. And that, I think, happened here in our own country as well. We know government is not the source of wealth creation. It is the energies of the private sector that shift growth and jobs to a higher level, a sustainable level. And we have to help the private sector get on with the job, improve competitiveness and productivity, lower costs for business and lift incomes. We have to live within our means, keep our finances in shape and keep public debt down. Australia has put up high levels of government debt in recent years by our own standards, and we are committed to reversing this trend. For those of you in business, I think it's no different. If you don't control debt, debt comes to control you. And that is the sense of the direction we were heading for as a country. We are eliminating red and green tape that restricts business initiative and increases costs. Over the last 6 years, we witnessed a net increase in federal regulations of 21,000. Recently, our first repeal day removed 10,000 such regulations from the books. We will hold a repeal day every 6 months for as long as we are in office. These are the sorts of messages that I sought to convey last week in New York and again in Houston, and we received a very enthusiastic response and a very interested response. We aim to reduce the cost of complying with federal regulations by about $1 billion a year. And we are moving to scrap the carbon and mining taxes, themselves a source of costly regulations, as well as their job-destroying cost impact and their inability to solve the problems that both were intended to solve. Our philosophy is that businesses and individuals need to take more responsibility for their own success or failure. It's why we have made a very clear signal with a number of decisions to signpost that we are not a government that is going to persist with corporate welfare. Most importantly, we need to back our country's strengths, the things we do as well as anybody and better than most. And these are the reforms on which Australia and the US are in so many respects aligned, and in a globally competitive marketplace will be a huge asset for our relationships as we look ahead. And they are the sorts of views that I find in my dealings with the TPP in particular. Mike Froman, who's leading the charge with the 12 countries, we do have a meeting of the minds on so many things, and it is, in a sort of unspoken way, it is clearly a great benefit as we debate and negotiate and try to persuade other countries about the merit of some of these approaches as we seek to nail down this TPP arrangement. We already have a highly robust trade and investment relationship with the United States. It's been built over decades and decades of shared values, like-mindedness, and an eye for entrepreneurial, innovative business activity. Next year, we celebrate an economic milestone, the 10th anniversary of the entry into force of the Australia-United States Free Trade Agreement. This landmark agreement has been the catalyst for greater economic integration between our two countries, from which we have both benefited enormously. After 8 years, we'd seen a 38% increase in two-way trade between our two countries. Many of the significant capital costs associated with the mining boom were sourced from the US as a consequence of the free trade agreement, which saw us source in the most efficient and cost-effective way so much of the inputs which drove the mining boom, the mining and energy boom in Australia over the last 10 or 12 years. As mentioned earlier, the US is the largest foreign investor, $658 billion of investment. The United States is also by far Australia's most important destination for investment abroad, around $472 billion. So we're only $158 billion behind the US in terms of investment, which is a remarkable figure. And it is a lot of our pension or superannuation funds that have gone to the US looking for a safe home. And it's been an interesting debate in Australia about how can we get the superannuation funds invested back into Australia. I'm over there getting money to come this way, and the Australian big super funds are sending it that way. But there are reasons for it. We've still got a very thin capital market, and those funds are spread across literally over 500,000 separate funds, including many self-managed funds. So it's like trying to shovel frogs into a wheelbarrow, getting them organised. But Australia's strengths broadly align with the drivers of foreign direct investment from the United States. Resources and energy, agribusiness and food, tourism and hospitality, health and medical research, and all of the services and the technology and the high-end manufacturing and the infrastructure that clusters around those strengths as a country. They're the things that we as a government are very much focused on. We are not going to be preoccupied spending a majority of our time trying to deal with weaknesses, which many governments around the world do because of the squeaky wheel syndrome and the ballot box. We're going to try and act like a company would, which spends the majority of its time trying to leverage its strengths. And as a country, we've got great strengths, but we need to keep a focus. I've done now 34 investment roundtables in 11 countries. since the election, and I'm like a broken record about the strengths we've got in the country and the opportunities that are emerging. Now, all of those are very much aligned with the strengths that the US has, a very complementary relationship in so many respects. And the great benefit, I think, of many of these free trade agreements and the trade that it fosters and the investment that it fosters is that it brings in new perspectives. It brings in informed capital. It brings in competition. And all of these things drive innovation. And without innovation, both our countries are going to slip. The whole world is not going to deal with many of the challenges. Innovation is at the heart, I think, of sustainable economic growth. And this competition, but also the different strengths that you draw from another country, does, in many respects, highly stimulate innovation. Australia wants US investment, and we are a good place to invest. Australia is experiencing as I said earlier, our 23rd consecutive year of growth, and much of that success stemming from the open and responsive nature of our economy. We sailed through the Asian financial crisis with 3% growth, the tech wreck, 3% growth. At the time, I was running the Australian arm of a big US company, a $2 billion a year business out of Arkansas, of all places, and they could not understand why I was asking for a significant increase in the marketing budget for this. It was a data engineering firm that I was running in Australia, while they were sacking thousands of people, professionals, from their organisations in the US. That was the first time ever, I think, that Australia, hasn't gone into recession when the US is in recession. And we sailed through that at 3% growth. We sailed through the 9/11 at 3% growth. We sailed through the global financial crisis with 3% growth. And I think a lot of that is due to the fact that we are such now an open economy, and there was in the 80s and 90s a bipartisan view about the importance of opening up our economy in such a significant way compared to many other parts of the world. The latest figures indicate growth of 3.5% in the 12 months to March, the fastest in almost 2 years. There is confidence, I think, returning. Rates of inflation, unemployment and public debt are low by OECD standards, which AAA rated by all three major global ratings agencies. And my trip to the US was all about promoting these strengths and the opportunities of the Australian economy. And not just in a short-term time frame, looking decades ahead because so many of the investments that are important to us, both in resources and energy and in agriculture in particular, but also in health and medical research, where we are a world leader, in international education, vocational and higher education, and in tourism and hospitality. All of those industries, really the capital we're trying to attract needs to look long term, needs to look decades ahead. And these were the sorts of areas that I took to the US and Canada last week. We had some really impressive people on our delegation, representatives from a range of major Australian companies and organisations, including groups like BHP Billiton, Boeing Australia, the Garvan Medical Research Institute, Lend-Lease, Transurban, Osmine, and a host of others. They all represent some of the key areas of growth and strength within our economy. Resources and energy, where enormous opportunities remain beyond the height of the boom. The predictions of the death of the mining boom, I think, is quite premature, especially the energy side of that boom. Huge scope for further growth, particularly in LNG. The International Energy Agency forecasts global demand for LNG, much of it from Asia, predicted to increase by more than 50% by 2035. And I think about 27 or 30% of that increase by 2020. The opportunities even in just a few years ahead, notwithstanding what's coming on the market in the next year or two, beyond that there are enormous opportunities for LNG. Australia is already the third largest LNG producer in the world, but as major new developments in Queensland and Western Australia come on stream, we are positioning to overtake Qatar as the largest producer within 2 to 3 years. US investment can play a hugely important role in this next phase, just as it has done in the boom of the last 12 years. And I do think that if the US does export gas, which I think it will come into the Asia-Pacific region, and it will provide important competition. It will give a lot more depth to the market, and I think it'll be a good thing for our gas industry. It will, in many ways, work against some of the higher cost countries and provide advantages for both our countries, not only as competitors, but so often in joint ventures. And that's what you see so often, especially in these areas of business that I've just nominated. So many times you're competing, and in the next project you are partners, and then competing on the one after. So it's as I said, it is a very important way of transferring innovation and expertise from one country to another. I have some personal experience, as I said, working on the Gorgon gas project, and the outlook for shale gas is also very exciting. In Australia, we're estimated to have the 7th largest deposits of recoverable shale resources in the world, potentially adding another century to our gas resource life. That is on top of the coal seam gas we are now beginning to export in very major quantities, largely from Gladstone. None of this is to overlook more traditional sources of energy, such as coal, which remains our second largest export, as well as our great mineral strengths in the fields such as iron ore, currently our largest merchandise export. We have recently introduced new measures like the exploration development incentive that will allow investors to deduct a portion of mining exploration expenditure against their taxable income. Then we have infrastructure. Rapid growth has left Australia with an infrastructure shortfall estimated at $700 million. In this regard, our new National Asset Recycling Initiative attracted enormous interest last week among the investment funds in New York and Toronto, because the proposal involves giving the states, the federal government giving the states a 15% bonus on the sale price of any public asset they privatise, as long as all the proceeds go back into the construction of new public assets. With the Australian states holding an estimated $200 billion worth of assets appropriate for privatisation, this opens up the prospect of many attractive brownfield, greenfield and public-private partnership investments. That was of particular interest, and it shows another example of how a close collaboration can lead to the sharing and the migration of good public policy. There was great enthusiasm to introduce these notions. The US has very few privatisations. I think 3 states out of 51 are actually have any sort of privatisation of any consequence, and the same is true in Canada. And I was able to explain that we had a budget 5 weeks ago. This proposal hit the table, and in the time since then, the 3 eastern states have all nominated projects around $60 billion worth that they're looking to put on the table. Now, these are most attractive brownfield investments for pension funds, but they're also enormously attractive greenfield because we have put a stipulation that the money has to go back into other infrastructure. So I had interest on all sides of the deal over there, and they're not opportunities. There's a lot of money around, but there's not a lot of projects. And we have created a public policy tool, I think, which is going to very significantly advance Australia in the short term. And as I say, it's the sort of public policy, if it does deliver, it can have influence on other countries, particularly places like the US. If the US decided to privatise, as we have here in our country, the sorts of assets, they would soak up activity in construction for the next 40 years. Hopefully they do it in a sort of measured way over time. To further assist, our recent budget foreshadowed another $50 billion to help fund upgrades of key assets. Over the next 20-year period, the United Nations estimates that Australia will have the 3rd fastest population growth in the OECD, and we have rapidly growing urban areas. 89% of us live in major cities along the eastern coastline. This is putting pressure on urban infrastructure. The cost of congestion reached $20 billion a year, but we'll reach that by 2020. So we need a new wave of infrastructure spending to address this, and it will be a big focus of our ongoing relationship with the United States. You want informed capital. You want people who have got experience in investing in Australia. And no matter what's happening in the region around us and the capital that's emerging, a very important part of our future relies on consolidating that base, that foundation of informed capital from the United States. We want to expand the private sector's role in financing and building infrastructure. We have a 25-year history of private sector involvement in infrastructure development, commencing with the Sydney Harbour Tunnel. We want a greater range of alternative methods of financing, such as public-private partnerships, concessional bridging loans and asset privatisations. There are plenty of greenfield opportunities, like West Connex in Sydney, 33 kilometres of roads and tunnels costing $11 billion, or the Perth Freight Link, the first toll road in Western Australia to improve access to Fremantle Port, a $1.6 billion cost to be sourced through public-private partnerships. We also have our vision for Northern Australia, a new investment frontier with potential to expand resources and energy, but also tourism, agriculture, tropical health and medical research and education. The North represents half the land area of Australia, but is currently home to just 1 million people. Developing Northern Australia is crucial for Australia's future and its integration with Asia. There are huge opportunities for US-Australian cooperation in this regard. To meet the rapidly growing needs of the rapidly growing middle classes, they need food, they need medicine, they need consumables, they need technology, holidays and education. Projects across the board, infrastructure and resources and energy, seriously expanded agribusiness, high-quality expanded tourism, tropical health services and advanced manufacturing. For example, given the worldwide ageing population, investment in medical research and aged care facilities is one area of opportunity I think Australia and the US are well placed to grab together. Again, every visit to China, I can't tell you how often people raise with me the concern about their aged care facilities, and trying to learn from the experience of developed countries who have had a different culture towards the looking after their aged. The federal budget has just earmarked $20 billion for the world's biggest medical research fund, delivering an extra $1 billion a year in perpetuity to medical research by 2020. Again, at the Texas Medical Centre, just last Friday, we had nearly a full day there with some of the leaders of the Australian medical fraternity, and the opportunities for cooperative efforts are just enormous. Huge opportunities for investment and collaboration in pharmaceuticals, biologics, especially relevant to the tropics, where 40% of the world's population resides. So we've got 1 million people in a major tropical area, and yet 40% of the world, if you go around the tropics between Capricorn and Cancer, you've got 40% of the world's population, and it's expected 50% within 20 years. High-end manufacturing, like what we're seeing in Geelong in Victoria or in Western Sydney for medicine, medical devices. Massive opportunities to develop tropical medicine expertise and research in Queensland and Northern Territory, like at James Cook University. We're one of the only 2 developed nations in the tropical zone, and the need for medical services and products is going to skyrocket in the coming decades. Australia and the US are perfectly placed to harness our intellectual capital and research capabilities here. To this end, our business delegation, as I said, visited the Texas Medical Centre and laid some very important foundations and links. Our 2 countries share the deep and fundamental belief in freedom, and that means the free market as well. Australia has secured free trade agreements, as Robert Hill mentioned, in Japan and Korea, our 2nd and 3rd largest trading partners respectfully, and we're hopeful that we might secure China sometime this year, towards the end of this year. Those 3 countries alone represent 51% of all of our exports. They are very high priorities for us on coming to government. And we are hopefully within reach of a similar agreement with China, but these agreements are important as they constitute bricks in the wall for freeing up global trade and investment. Australia and the United States share active commitment to negotiating other bilateral and multilateral agreements. The Trans-Pacific Partnership agreement is a priority. President Obama made this very clear on our trip last week. The TPP would bring together economies accounting for just under 40% of the world's GDP and 800 million people. So to increase more seamless trade and much lower protection amongst 40% of the world's GDP will provide almost an imperative for other countries in the region to join forces if we have open architecture and a very high quality agreement. We're also currently negotiating the Trade in Services Agreement, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, the Pacific Agreement on Closer Economic Relations, the Information Technology Agreement and the Environmental Goods Agreement, amongst others. In all of these, we are working closely, if not co-chairing, with our counterparts in the United States. We are, as a team, working on so many of these agreements which will create much wealth and opportunity for so many people around the world. Globally, we all need to push for structural reform. Together, Australia and the US need to find ways to make it easier and cheaper to do business. Trade and investment reforms, whether bilateral, regional or global, are, as I see it, the bricks in the wall of freer global trade, leading to higher sustainable growth and jobs. Together, we're working to strengthen global and regional economic architecture with a long history of collaboration in the WTO, APEC and EAS to promote sustainable growth. Could I just say in conclusion, the next 35 to 40 years will see an explosion in the numbers of people in the middle class in the region, from India to China and every country in between, from about 600 million people today to around 3 billion people in 35 to 40 years, estimated. This will present extraordinary opportunities, but it will also present major challenges. And for this reason, it will be the century of water, food and energy security, with a high priority, a desperate need for high levels of innovation. Throughout this century, the long-standing successful commercial partnerships between Australia and the US will be central in assisting our region maximise these opportunities while coping effectively and peacefully with the challenges. Thanks very much.
You want to sit or do? Which would you prefer? Yeah, okay, you stay there. Well, thank you very much, Andrew. And as Andrew said, he'd take a few questions before he rushes back to question time.
Yes.
Can't have the Minister arriving late. It's not a good look. Why don't I start by saying, Andrew, one thing that I've heard people ask, a little puzzled by, is if we're developing such almost a comprehensive set of bilateral trade agreements with the region and the US is doing likewise, why then do we need another layer in the form of a regional agreement? What's the added value that you would get from that?
Well, I spent 10 years of my life in the 80s running the Farmers Federation and had a lot to do with multilateral, the attempts at multilateral trade agreements, which I think are obviously the optimum, but I'm still getting counselling for that 10 years of frustration. I then had subsequent experience with bilateral agreements. I did a lot of work in Thailand when I was in business, and the thing I noticed is that in a bilateral with Australia, they moved on things they never would have moved on in a broader agreement or even a multilateral, much less a multilateral agreement. But they moved on issues, and therefore the next time they went to negotiate another agreement with someone else, their dairy industry had undertaken some structural adjustment, and it was easier for them to move the next time. I saw it again with with our bilateral with Japan. We broke through for the first time ever in the 5 sacred areas of rice, grain, dairy, beef and sugar. And we didn't get rice, but we did break through in the other 4, and some of them in a most significant way. And Abe wants his third arrow, which is structural adjustment. It's a very important thing to him. That was the first real opportunity to do it, but I can see that they were allowing even further room for TPP on my sort of information. And also, when I've seen them since, all of their great concerns about the reaction of their sectors to the bilateral with Australia haven't materialised. And I can see their confidence now to go into another agreement. Okay, so I think they're building blocks, to be honest, and the bilaterals produce good results, but you get into this TPP, it'll even be more ambitious. But also, when you link all those countries with the same set of rules, you get more seamless trade between them, and a lot of those trade facilitation rules are enormously costly, and if you get them harmonised, you make enormous gains.
Thanks. Another question? Who would like to... Are we going to get TPP? And if so, when?
I think this year's out. I mean, we'll keep negotiating, and there's quite a momentum, I feel, and we are into the last. I think we're over 80% of the way. Though a fellow from China said to me recently in something else we were doing, this is a 100-mile journey, and we're more than 90 miles into the journey, so we're nearly halfway there. It does explain how the last part's the most difficult and usually the most important. And that's where we're at. There is now, I think the US and Japan have had a breakthrough in terms of their negotiation. They're 70% of the 40% of the world's GDP. So we decided on market access, those two should go at it first, and then with an eye to the concessions feeding off into all the other 12 countries once they'd reached an agreement. So we're at that stage, and all the countries now are dealing with the US and with Japan. So with the political will, it could conclude fairly quickly. I don't think the Republicans have said it will not get through this year, have said to me privately, and probably have been saying it publicly. But next year, I think in the first half of the year, there's a political opportunity in the US potentially, and if they go after that, you start to run into the politics of the next presidential election. So I think the first half of next year, I think we'll be there more or less with the content. It's then just the politics.
Okay.
Down the
question up the back.
Thanks, Minister. My name is John Pelez from Pacific Brands. Having worked in and lived in Asia for many years, looking after most countries' manufacturing operations there, I found that whenever an American business had a challenge, they would approach their government in those markets, and they'd be straight in the meeting with them. The British government would host a cocktail party. Australia would send you to Austrade. So I'm just wondering whether or not, under this government, we're going to see a much more proactive approach through Austrade in helping Australian businesses expand their relationships and land business in Asia.
Thanks. Well, let me say to start with, I think, we've got 2 million people in Australia who speak an Asian language at home, and the majority of those speak Mandarin. So in terms of Australia trying to penetrate those markets, we have got a source, 2 million out of 23, many of whom are in one way or another helping that process, and that puts us at a major advantage. Also, I do think that the sort of approach that Australians take, probably out of experience, is far more effective than the approach often taken by our US counterparts. And I think in that respect, as a team, we can be very effective just because of the different styles that we bring to the region. Thirdly, though, to get to your point, I'm the first trade and investment minister we've ever had in Australia, and it means that we have got someone at a cabinet level who has a responsibility for investment. I have, as I said earlier, done 34 round tables now. I've sat in front of many trillions of dollars of many managers who are responsible for many trillions of dollars of investment. And many of them are sympathetic to Australia. Some are even educated here out of Singapore and places. But they had no investments here because no one ever gets in front of them and tells them the narrative of what's in prospect, identifies projects that they might be able to show some interest in. So, I think, in fairness, I can see Austrade jumping out of its skin because I'm getting meetings with ministers and with senior business that, the chairman and the CEOs of any company that I really want to have a chat with I'm getting in front of them, and our ambassadors often can never get that sort of access. But the ambassadors come with me, and then if we do light a spark, the ambassador and their team in Austrade can run with it. So I think, you know, the 700 people we took to China was a very proactive approach. 4 cities, nearly $1 billion worth of deals done out of that. We've had a $3.5 billion in series of investments from one person who was at the infrastructure roundtable for tourism, who realised, because all his peers reported what they were doing, that he was underweight in Australia, and has since identified $3.5 billion worth of projects, which is in the process of consummating. So we are already far more on the front foot, but a lot of it is getting through the door and having a person at a cabinet level with the investment responsibility is doing just that, I think.
Well, I think we should let Andrew go. Thank you very much, Andrew.
Thanks very much.
You get 100% for application, I can tell you that. Okay.